Dr. Naidoo, when you look at nutrition as a whole, I think one thing that all nutritional camps seem to agree on, whether it's people that are carnivore, maybe they're vegan, maybe they're omnivores, this and that, is they all tend to agree that modulating inflammation is a very important thing.
Yes.
And you and I have been swimming in the research for a long time surrounding this particular diet, and it seems to, at least on paper and from my own anecdotal experience, be very, very good at modulating inflammation. And before we kind of talk about the diet specifically, like, what is inflammation when we're talking about it, like, from a dietary perspective?
I love that question, because inflammation is a word that often gets confused, because the body has acute inflammation, which happens when we fall over in sports and scrape our knee, or we injure something, and then the body has a whole system of helping that heal, and that's acute inflammation. But what we're referring to when it comes to food is more chronic insidious inflammation, which builds up slowly over time. And one of the ways it builds up is through a poor diet. So eating processed, ultra-processed foods, very sugary foods, added and refined sugars, those types of things that we've spoken about in terms of driving even symptoms of anxiety. These can drive inflammation. But the interesting thing about inflammation that's really evolved over the last decade or so is that in mental health, more and more research is showing that inflammation also drives conditions like anxiety, depression, cognitive disorders, and more. So it's not just, it's causing some inflammation in your gut. It's actually also impacting your mental health. So inflammation is something we have to be paying attention to for our overall health, but also our mental well-being.
I would highly recommend a product called Seed if you're looking for a probiotic. It's not the takeaway from this video, don't get me wrong. I just thought I'd mention it because people always ask me what probiotic I recommend. So I put a link down below that saves you 25% off Seed's Daily Symbiotic, which is a prebiotic and a probiotic in one. You've seen me talk about it before, a capsule inside of a capsule. So really cool multi-stage delivery, fascinating research behind it. I just really stand behind it. It's the one that I personally use, and that is the honest truth. I don't use a lot of supplements, but probiotics are one that I do throw into the mix now and then, and I do use Seed. So that link is down below, 25% off. Highly, highly recommend it, especially if you're making a dietary change. So whenever you make a change, it's important to help remodel the gut microbiome by adding in a good probiotic. And most probiotics, in my opinion, are garbage. So that link down below for a good one.
I totally agree. And you can feel it immediately when you're eating something that's not exactly good, but you can feel it definitely more chronically when your diet has been consistently poor for a while.
Yes.
And I think when we're talking about, the quote unquote sort of best diet for reducing inflammation, I think that's you have to take kind of a big holistic look at it, not just be like, okay, well, the trick is to eat this one particular food. And I think the diet we're both talking about is the Mediterranean diet.
Yes.
Now that everyone's heard what the diet is, they'll click off the video. But I encourage you to want to break down the different components of it, because I think there's different elements of the Mediterranean diet that make it so key for modulating inflammation. So it'd be interesting to kind of have some back and forth. You being, a Harvard-trained psychiatrist and a nutritionist and a chef, you have a pretty good understanding of what's happening in the brain, and maybe we can have some back and forth, and I can talk about what's happening in the body.
I really like that, and I appreciate you highlighting something that many people, either you get the eye roll, or it's one more person saying eat the Mediterranean diet. There's so much more to it. There was some recent research published earlier in 2023 that in Nutrients that actually showed that the Mediterranean diet also impacts mental well-being, not just physical well-being. And there have been some prior studies of that too. Some of the focus of the other studies has been the actual composition of the Mediterranean diet, which, by the way, is not just a plant-forward diet. It also has healthy fats, certain types of meats or seafood, and a really good balance of things. And I feel like what it's talking about is getting us back to really a whole foods diet, which in the US we've moved away from. So it's a much more powerful term that we should be paying attention to, and not just assuming that it's something to be swept aside, because I think it can actually help us.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that when you look at the Mediterranean diet, it's easy to think that this is a very low meat diet. And you look at the Mediterranean regions, I mean, it varies widely, right? I mean, you've got
It does.
certain regions that are consuming, I don't want to say copious amounts of meat, but I mean, we're talking 30 to 40% protein, like, you know.
Yes, from animal sources.
Yeah,
Yes.
and that's not a small amount. So, and they seem to have the same sort of outcomes as some of these other more plant-forward Mediterranean regions, which kind of leads us to believe that, well, I'll ask you, I don't know, because it's kind of, there's no right or wrong answer right now because I don't know if we have the literature, but, you know, is the Mediterranean diet good because of what's in it, or is it good because of what's not in it?
I love that question. I think it's both, and I'll tell you why. It focuses on the whole foods that we've forgotten how to eat. I'll tell you a funny story. I don't know if I'm allowed to call out a brand name, but I never knew what a Pop-Tart was. And it was the first time in my life that I'd ever encountered a food like that. And it was fascinating to me because, of course, it tasted delicious until I realized, you know, what went into it. But this is an example of sort of growing up in a culture where breakfast was savory and then being introduced to a very new food when I moved to Boston to study. And it speaks to the fact that there's this process that you forget that you actually used to eat this wholesome breakfast. And maybe, you know, you're spoiled and your mom or your grandmother prepared it for you, which in my case was true. But you forget that, and your mind suddenly gets into, well, why don't I have this? It's so much easier, it's quick, it's on the go kind of thing. I feel like the Mediterranean diet is really almost in a way taking us back to those principles. Maybe that wasn't the original intention, but it's a whole foods diet. There isn't processed food in it. And I would argue that, you know, say that it has a certain type of legume in it, and you buy black beans in a can or chickpeas in a can. Yes, there's some processing, but you rinse them out, and they actually still the whole food. They haven't added a ton of stuff unless you buy a can that's processed. But I feel that it sort of it encourages us to step back from processed foods and say, why not lean into those plants? Why not have this healthy fat from the seafood? Why not have the nuts and seeds, you know, and have the grains that we should be eating, because a certain amount of the healthy grains are really important for our gut microbes. So I think it would be a bit of both.
Yeah, no, I agree. In fact, there's a paper that I referenced in a video last week that I was filming, and it was looking at the level of beta glucans, which you're obviously familiar with. You know, a very important type of sort of, I guess you could call it a prebiotic. You could categorize it. What would you categorize beta glucans as?
Usually, I think of it as a prebiotic.
Yeah. So they were looking at comparing like various forms of, starting with refined wheat, ranging all the way up to the highest levels of beta glucans in whole grain barley. Okay. And it was very interesting to see the effects on inflammation and a number of other biomarkers, just looking at the range, like as the level of beta glucans went up and the less refined the grain became, it really was a very, very positive impact. Whereas I think there's a common theme out there that, you know, grains are a problem. And
yes.
I think grains certainly can be a problem.
They can be, yeah.
But it's like, how many of us, like when was the last time most of us in the United States have had a half a cup or 3/4 of a cup of whole grain barley?
Yes.
Like really?
Right.
You know, so it's so hard for us to like make a statement that's accurate to say like, well, grains are problematic. Well, okay, we have to have context here.
You have to have context, and the processing, the way that it's made. Wheat is the same thing, although that's actually a whole other situation. But I agree with you there, because I feel as though when in the United States, when we think about grains, it's a very limited spectrum of what we think about. It's either highly processed oatmeal that people think about, that's more the instant version that has a lot of added, you know, unhealthy foods to it, or it's exactly how often do you see people go out and cook barley as their grain? I think quinoa has taken on a little bit more, and it's a great source of fiber and protein, but sometimes people get a bit lost with that and they're not quite sure how to cook it. But I encourage people to do that. And in fact, in my book, Calm Your Mind with Food, I have like a hot porridge, like a it's almost, think oatmeal but made with quinoa, because of the protein and the fiber content of it. I want people to kind of get used to other ways of thinking about it, and you literally make it directly from the grain. Context is extremely important, so I appreciate that point.
Yeah, I think people think Mediterranean. And another thing, I think culturally and just geographically how things are different too. I'm not going to go down the glyphosate rabbit hole right now, but obviously there's a difference between even the levels of gluten and gliadin in like true Italian or European pasta compared to what's here. And you're a culinary expert, so I've only heard this on the surface, but is that true? Like, is food pretty different there?
So clinically, I've actually had individuals who can eat bread in places like Hungary or other parts of Europe, including Italy, and not be able to consume local American bread. I've also had individuals comment that if they eat a bowl of pasta at a restaurant in the United States, for sure, if they've added pasta to that week or a few times that week, they're going to see their numbers on the scale increase. They're going to gain weight or feel a certain way, including things like just feeling bloated or just uncomfortable. But they eat it and they enjoy it. They will go to Italy and eat pasta, A, portion size, very different, B, made from scratch, C, healthy fats added, and have pasta when they're traveling. It'll come back and say, I'm shocked, Dr. Naidoo, I did not gain 10 pounds. I thought for sure I'm going to come back and be overweight. But there's definitely a difference. And then there have been books written about the way that wheat has been kind of engineered in this country. And we know that the wheat product that we have in the United States is very different. So I don't know the facts of how the wheat is produced in Italy, but it's a healthier grain. And I know that from people's experience of how they can eat pasta, how they can eat those grains or those really consume gluten in a different form overseas, but they can't do it here. And I think it's, what we've done to our wheat.
Yeah, I agree. And even if we get down to processed meat, right? In Europe or Italy, you've got, prosciutto or Parma ham. It's a processed meat, right? And on the surface, you think, okay, well, that's exactly what is a carcinogen and exactly what we should avoid. You're like, well, their version of a processed meat is ham and salt.
Yeah, right? That's correct. And the way that they make their hams and their prosciutto and all of that is very different. It's completely different. It doesn't necessarily go through a machine. Yeah. So I think it's a very different product, and they may not be adding things like nitrates. I don't know if you've seen recently, there's some supermarkets where if you're choosing something for charcuterie or cold meat, that they will actually be labeled nitrate free. And one of the reasons, well, of course, my lens is mental health, the nitrates in those added processed meats can actually drive depression. So I'm not sure that the food industry has picked up on that, but I think they're trying to tell you that it's a healthier product. But I think how we're producing it here, like a slice of bologna is very different from a Parma ham or something like that in Italy.
Yeah, I even saw one paper, it was like Parma ham actually has bioactive peptides in it that have actually a beneficial effect above and beyond even just say regular ham in that particular case. And I think it kind of comes back to this whole thing of like, okay, are you looking at a Mediterranean diet as like what this ideal of a Mediterranean diet is, or are you really looking at like what do the Mediterranean regions eat? Because I know there's studies that say stronger adherence to Mediterranean principles leads to X, Y, Z, and that stuff's fascinating. Don't get me wrong, but I really like to look at the true like cultural geographic data where you're seeing like even the socioeconomic piece, the sociodemographic piece of like, okay, well, let's look at what people have as this ideal of the Mediterranean diet, and let's really look at the real Mediterranean diet. Because I think what you and I are talking about is the real Mediterranean diet, right?
I think so. I feel that that's what we're talking about. And I also want to add in, some another context to this, that, for example, the work of the regions of the blue zones and what they eat. You mentioned Sardinia, it's considered a blue zone. Costa Rica, predominantly, one of the things they eat a lot of is black beans. Japan, one of the things they eat a lot of is seafood. So it's not the Mediterranean diet. It's not. They talk about those Mediterranean principles. All I'm pointing out is that they can be different foods, but they're still whole foods. And I think that when we're talking about the Mediterranean diet, what you and I are talking about is how it's described and not how it's been interpreted.
Yeah.
I think there's a lot of interpretation of the Mediterranean diet being entirely plant-based. It's not. Those regions are not plant-based regions, and that doesn't mean that they aren't predominantly groups that eat a lot of vegetables, because they are. But I think the more we label and include and exclude, the more confusing that information gets to everyone out there trying to eat healthy. It gets to be a puzzle that they can't solve, and then it's just easier to pick up frozen food or fast foods,
Such a solid point.
Right? It's just like, it's too much for people to figure out.
I'm really glad you mentioned the different regions of the blue zones too, because it's just, if you look at on the surface of it, you think, okay, blue zones are pushing a plant-based angle. Or like, well, actually, if you look at the different regions of the blue zones, like they all are very, very different. And there might be some common denominators,
right,
but that doesn't mean that is the case, right? I think the most important common denominator is, not to go on a tangent, but is probably their lifestyle, their activity, and their relationships.
I was just gonna say having a tribe, the power 9? I think they talk about. Yep. Tribe, context, eating together. They even throw in a glass of wine in some regions. Yet some regions like Loma Linda are entirely plant-based. So it does vary, and I think in the United States, we need to be able to embrace, and I'm not saying this with judgment, I'm just saying I think we need to be more open-minded and inclusive around food, because the more that we message around this is good, this is bad, don't eat this, only eat that, the more confused people become, and then it's like, hey, I might as well just pick up fast food, because I'm not going to be able to figure it out on my own anyway. But I think if we're messaging or talking about food, then just offering some guidelines. And not guidelines without judgment.
Yeah. I mean, speaking of guidelines, what are some ways that people can add Mediterranean flair to their diets? Because I think there's multiple elements. We can talk about those different elements, but like, what are some ways that people like, okay, my family can't go full bore Mediterranean. Like maybe it's just not practical. Like what are some ways that people can add some of the flair from a Mediterranean protocol into their life to get some of those benefits and those anti-inflammatory effects and the mental health benefits?
I think we can break it down into some simple principles. Think about where you get your fats from. Think about olive oil, avocado oil, and actual avocados. Think about nuts and seeds as a group, rather than what type of nut or what type of seed. And then think, if you're going to have, if you happen to eat seafood and you're meat eating, think about the quality of what you're getting. Is it grass-fed beef? If it's within socioeconomically something you can afford to get, because they tend to be more pricey. Can you get pasture-raised chickens? Can you get pasture-raised lamb? Whatever it is, can you get a better version of it? And if you can't, I would still eat the actual food than a processed version of it, right? So we're going to go on that principle. And then I love to talk about the kaleidoscope of colors, because it's much more than the colors of the rainbow. I designed a recipe called a kaleidoscope salad, because honestly, the multiple polyphenols and phytonutrients, vitamins, and everything that is found, including fiber, in these different colored vegetables brings back biodiversity for your gut. Plus, it's nourishing your body. And these are satiating foods that are not going to add in a ton of calories. So think about the cauliflowers, the broccolis of the world, the cruciferous vegetables. Think about the leafy greens and lean into those, rather than thinking, oh, well, I don't eat chickpeas. Because they're made in a Mediterranean food called hummus. Maybe your version of that is black beans, or a type of bean that's an actual legume, not some processed version of it. So maybe that's what you add into your diet. I thought about this because I was called out by a medical student, Tom, when I was a more junior attending, and this very, very smart medical student said to me, well, Dr. Naidoo, I don't know why all you doctors talk about the Mediterranean diet, and I'm South Asian, And this student was, I think, East Asian. She said, in my culture, we don't know what chickpeas are. My culture, we eat, she was Chinese by ethnicity, we eat a lot of black beans. And that really taught me something, because what she was saying is, she went on to explain, when I talk to patients, I want to be able to provide a context for what they're eating. And her own lens gave her that sensitivity that she understands that. So if she's talking about chickpeas, what is that really? Now, she'd eaten chickpeas and all of that, but it really gave me a context to develop these recipes called Mediterranean, meaning, Mediterranean flavors and vegetables, but maybe some spices or different components of an Asian diet. So that it's more inclusive, that more people like it, more flavors, same principles, the best colors, the best healthy fats, the clean proteins, as we call them, and, the nuts and seeds and grains that a certain culture may eat. And I feel like that makes it much more user-friendly for people,
Yeah, it's kind of closed-minded to just say, okay, well, Mediterranean's the best, because now we have so much literature and we have the logistics to be able to say, well, oh, what's great about Mediterranean? Well, what's great about Indian? Well, what's great about, okay, well, certainly in each region, there's going to be great food and there's going to be awful food for you.
That's right.
And it's like, Hong Kong, for instance, they have the longest life expectancy in the world. They're not a blue zone, but you know what they eat? They eat a lot of stir fry with a lot of fiber and a lot of veggies. And a lot of meat and a lot of probably meats that we wouldn't even touch in America, right? It's just, they eat, and yet they have the longest life expectancy. It's so interesting. And then you're like, okay, you've got maybe some benefits that you would get from Ayurvedic type of things that you wouldn't have in the Mediterranean. So it's like, why can't we cherry pick a little bit?
That's right.
Now that we have the ability to?
And make those choices and make it a little bit of all of the good stuff and put it in one place. And I feel like the overarching description of the Mediterranean diet allows for that flexibility. I think we just need to be more creative and more inclusive. So a kaleidoscope of colors, adding in, one of the hummus dishes I make, I'll add in Indian spices. Why not flavor it up in a way that you are more used to? It's just how you integrate the spice, right? So why can't you add turmeric with a pinch of black pepper, which is more pulling from Ayurvedic times, I think there's a way, or put it in roasted vegetables along with other spices. You can mix it up, and I feel like we need to be creative about helping ourselves move forward towards more whole foods, if we can, because I think that's providing a solution that people can understand.
Yeah. Do you know of it? Is there any literature that takes a look at rates of, say, anxiety, depression in other countries versus the U.S. That you've seen that might kind of help us reflect on maybe what diet is really good for mental health? And obviously, there's so many other factors that come into play, but not sure if I haven't seen any literature. Maybe you have.
I don't know that it's as specific, and I'll tell you why. I always feel, that even the nutritional science and even the nutrition epidemiological studies can be challenging, right? Because of the method that we collect data and, relying on small data sets, because nutrition research is just not funded like pharmaceutical research. Anecdotally, yes, I know that when I've at conferences or have conversations about certain dietary patterns overseas versus what we eat in the United States is definitely a difference. But I think that some of the things that are common are that the Mediterranean diet actually can impact improvement in mood and anxiety, not just physical health, so not just cardiovascular health or other things. And I feel like we know that certain foods just play a much bigger role in anxiety, and a lot of them are those plant-rich foods, those healthy fats. Again, coming back to the same principles, but then what I do in Calm Your Mind with Food is give people the context and the nuance to the different foods.
Definitely. So if we circle back kind of to the inflammation piece, would you say that it's the fiber, the antioxidants, the polyphenols, the fats. Like if you had to pick one, and I'm going to kind of put you on the spot and make you pick one, even though that probably is the entirety, like which ones do you think have the biggest impact, at least on the neuroinflammation side, the side that, inflammation that might impact our network stability and our executive function and whatnot?
I'm going to, for me, it was a toss-up between the fiber in these foods versus the polyphenols. I'm going to go with the polyphenols and the bioactives because we know from the ongoing research that they actually break down and interact with the gut microbes, and they are therefore helping with the formation of things like neurotransmitters. Fiber is extremely important. It helps to nurture the gut. It helps to fend off inflammation. But I'm feeling through the research and what I'm learning and studying that the polyphenols are a little bit more active in a certain way, in a more specific way. So they go beyond just having antioxidant and anti-inflammatory properties. They're interacting in a way. Remember, the 90 to 95% of the serotonin receptors are there. Serotonin production, they're doing a little bit more. So I feel like as we go down that path and we understand more, that they, I think, are more important.
I mean, so I learned recently, so polyphenols are almost a fiber in a way, right?
They are from plants. They are more specific, and then tell me what you were about to.
Yeah, no, I mean, so I kind of just learned that recently that it's polyphenols in fruit, polyphenols in vegetables, independent of the actual, say, fiber that you might see on a label, the insoluble or soluble fiber that's like specifically put on a label. Right. Like, sometimes these, I guess I could say, undetectable amounts of fiber that are in polyphenols are actually interacting with our, triggering feeding and cross-feeding of the gut, and that's like actually having possibly an even bigger impact than fiber itself, which is kind of interesting.
I agree with you because I feel like they probably shouldn't be split up, but it's the way that we kind of learn about them. But the more that the ongoing research on the gut microbiome is showing, like when we're looking now at the sort of exciting field of psychobiotics, right, which is, can we use food to actually, adequately treat mental health? Can we use how we put foods together, which I think is very exciting. And I think we're going to learn more about the impact of the bacteria. The other thing, so I was reviewing some recent research on looking at the actual microbial strains, and like Lactobacillus rhamnosus impacts anxiety through GABA, and it's not that these are unknown facts. I mean, they've been in the research, and some of the research is newer, but it's cool to know that we now can identify those things. Or Lactobacillus reuteri is involved in anxiety through some of the receptors. Just like these little things that it's not just a polyphenol, it's not just a microbe. There's much more of an interaction and interplay between these things. But
yeah, it's quite interesting when you look at just even the interaction of polyphenols and how that impacts short chain fatty acids and how that impacts even our fatty acid oxidation, and it's like this giant loop that sometimes we miss the entire point of.
True, by either maybe touching only on the surface or labeling something. That's why I'm kind of a little bit over colors of the rainbow. I'm not saying we shouldn't use it, but it's not adequate enough to describe the depth of the involvement of those polyphenols and what they're actually doing. It's a great way to describe to people, eat a colorful meal, but there's much more going on with the short chain fatty acid loop, with everything else. And I think the more people understand, like, I'm a fundamental believer that people know what healthy eating is, like they know the general principles, but implementing it is hard. But I do feel as well that when people know a reason to eat something, that it clicks a little bit better into place. Like, this is the reason to eat this food. And it's beyond just the colors. It's the huge impact of these polyphenols, what they do. You may need to know the names. You don't need to know the names of the microbes involved. But you can understand that it's much more, it goes deeper than that.
Yeah. Do you think that a lot of the nutrition research. So even when we look at sort of the foods that are going to impact our psychology and impact mental illness, do you think that that literature is ever going to gain enough momentum? Or I can't help but think, and this isn't even anything necessarily negative, it's just probably the way it is once we start to understand the impact of a given food nutrient or a given nutrient in the brain, I would imagine that, oh, well, that gets interesting. Let's find a way to take this into the pharmaceutical setting, and then the research goes further there. Because a lot of the pharmaceutical research even starts from, well, what we learned with the impact of plant medicine and foods and this and that, and then it kind of goes off from there.
Right. I think that, I'm sure that could happen, but I feel like the more we can harness the food as medicine movement and think about the direction of research for psychobiotic use, the microbiome research that's going on, mostly in the private sector on a much more deeper level than say, some of the other trials that are being done. But not only, there's some great centers that are doing great microbiome research. I feel like that's going to offer us more solutions through food. I do feel like big pharma is always going to be part of this world and this country. And I think that there's always going to be the chase for the next drug for Alzheimer's, the next, or the next, cure for something. So I feel like that's where that attention is, which allows us a great amount of leverage in the food as medicine space to influence things in a positive way by how people eat.
Yeah, well, I think that there's a positive spin on it too, because I know there's, you've got the camps that are like, oh, okay, well, all the money's going into pharmaceutical research and not enough over here. I do think that if even pharmaceutical research gets a chance to piggyback off of the nutrition research, then there's sort of this cross communication where maybe both do get elevated, right? If there's a thoughtful acknowledgement of, yeah, okay, we learned about this from this food, and we realize that food has this impact. And if that serves as fodder for new pharmaceutical research, then great, more power to it. But at least it continues to solidify the fact that, well, maybe this research on food is more than just, how do I put this, giving people a solution that's going to keep them off of pharmaceuticals, right?
Right. It doesn't have to be this great divide. And I think that you and I agree upon this. It's not, it goes back to this, the mentality of what should you eat or what should you give up. I think the more inclusive we can be, even with that overlap of really harnessing the science of both industries, right? Yep. And making them work together would be a fantastic solution. And I really hope that, some of the solutions in the different spaces doing the research will come together in a certain way, because I think that can offer people more solutions that they need, not just a supplement. Like you can have a supplement, there's a place for supplements because we don't need a perfect diet, but maybe finding a way to leverage both.
Yeah, absolutely. And talking real quick on, on proteins for just a second, with the Mediterranean diet, or not even with the Mediterranean diet, how does protein potentially impact the gut and the brain? I think people might have this thought process that protein's bad for the gut, but protein has a positive impact as well, right?
Protein has a very, very positive impact, and it's a very important part of what we eat, irrespective of what your diet is, what your dietary pattern is. It's important for not just building muscle. It's important for other reactions in the body, and the less that we start to divide up the different food groups, right, into whether they're protein or let's just say the macro or the micronutrients, the easier it becomes for us to design a nutritional psychiatry plate, or just design a healthy plate of food, irrespective of what maybe, just because you want to eat healthy. I think that people get very caught up, and they're both sides to the research around the plant-based advocates will say you should never consume this type of meat because there are breakdown products in your gut that will be damaging. There's an opposite camp that will say, well, there's more research to show that these are not the most damaging breakdown products, and you actually can't consume them. So there's a lot of divide about that. And I feel for the everyday person who is just trying to eat healthy, meaning you're interested in the research. Maybe you want to go down the rabbit hole of the research. But if you just try and eat, why not choose the food that you want to eat in moderation? Try to spend that money on a great source of that, beef if you're having a steak, or tofu if that's what you eat. But to me, that's a better direction. But protein is extremely important, and we tend to ignore fiber in American diets. In fact, research has shown that we don't eat enough fiber. But I would say along with that, we should be consuming enough protein. And, you know, some of the time I will actually have, if I'm traveling, I will actually make sure that I have a protein smoothie as part of what I'm doing, because I'm running around and I'm not necessarily sitting down and able to eat a whole meal, or I'm in an airport and it's just harder to get a healthy meal in an airport. I can get food, but it may not be the best meal I'm having that week. So there are ways I think that we should be adaptable, but pay attention to the protein.
Definitely. Well, Dr. Naidoo, where can everyone find you and your book and whatnot?
So you can find me at umanaidoomd.com. Sign up for my newsletter where I talk about a different food each week and tell you how to prepare it, but also the science behind it. You can also find me on social media at DRUMANAIDOO. And my new book is called Calm Your Mind with Food, releasing December 26th of 2023. And you can check out my other book, This Is Your Brain on Food.
Perfect. We'll link out to all those below, and thank you so much.
Thanks so much.